Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this is week 8, and we're studying chapter 7, or we're reading chapter 7 this week. You're reading your text in MindTap, and there are no MindTap exercises due. This week we have a quiz, which is pretty standard in Blackboard in the module, the old 5-question deal, and you'll find it pretty easy, and I'll go through it at the end of this video. So this is by far the most important chapter in the book, in my opinion, because it's about the Constitution. And when we talk about the Constitution, actually what we're talking about is our federal government. So all of the dilemmas today, all the political issues today, all of the polarization today, it all stems from the Constitution and exactly the same issues as were being debated in the 1780s. So let me give you a little context in case you forgot where we were at in the class. Last week was the American Revolution, and as you may have heard, the Americans won and in the process gained independence from Great Britain. So that's kind of where we're at, and set the scene. So in Manhattan, the British are leaving the U.S. after being defeated in the Revolutionary War. So the last British troops leave out of Manhattan, and George Washington, rides in victorious. And now we have this dilemma that we have this new country, but we really don't have any federal government, any framework, or anything to build this country on as far as like laws. Do we have a president? Do we have a House? Do we have a Senate? Do we have a Supreme Court? None of that stuff was in place when the Americans beat the British at the end of the Revolution. So, at the beginning of the chapter, there's a couple of questions. So one of them is, what challenges confronted the new nation's leaders at home and abroad during the 1780s and 1790s? Well, the biggest challenge was they didn't have a government, so they had to figure out how that was all going to work. And then, another question is, what are the elements of the new American identity? What's the new identity? And here's a number of patriots and colonists who fought against Great Britain for independence, and they wrote this Declaration of Independence prior to the war, and it's all about equality, and we hold these truths to be self-evident, and all men are created equal, and all of this language that you find in the Declaration of Independence and that you find in the Constitution. If all men are created equal, well, how come there's slavery? How come the Native Americans are soon going to be moved off their land and put into reservations? How come women don't have the right to vote? If all men are created equal and the revolution is fought in this philosophy of equality, that we're kind of this new up and coming country, that's the dilemma. How can slavery exist? How can women's rights be non-existent? How can Native Americans be subjugated and re-civilized? How can all that happen? So that's a real dilemma. And so when we think about the national identity, then that's a real problem. And I think it's still a real problem, but we can talk some more about that. The other thing is, what about all of the interests of the citizens in a brand new country? Farmers want one thing, but business people want another thing. People that are in the shipping industry, in the harbors in Massachusetts Bay, their interest lay with, excise taxes and shipping and tariffs. But people who are growing cotton and count on slaves to harvest and plant their cotton, their interest is slavery. So there's all these divergent interests. And I think anytime we talk about diversity, we need to think about, okay, diversity is great, that's what we all want, but are we ready to face the challenges of a very diverse society? And that's exactly what the founders are up against when they start. So these are some of the issues that the founders are facing, and I apologize, this is going to be a long video, it might be a two-parter, but there's a lot to talk about. But just sort of understand this, you go from nothing, no country, just this loose affiliation of colonies, to something which is, hey, we're independent and now we have a country, and how are we going to run this thing? So that sets the scene. Now, it's important to understand that before the Constitution, there was something called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were basically brought about as a device to have the colonies come together in time of an emergency like the Revolution. So the Articles of Confederation were really good as far as making sure the colonies, cooperate as far as military goes and that sort of thing. But the problem with the Articles of Confederation is there was really no basis to run a country. The Articles of Confederation didn't have any power to tax. It didn't form any tax body. It didn't have any power to negotiate with a foreign country or to negotiate treaties. And by that I meant, there was no federal government. The Articles of Confederation were an agreement between colonies, but they didn't set up any kind of government. So if France wanted to come to the new U.S. and say, hey, we want to work out a treaty with you guys, who would they go to? There wasn't a central government. So would those treaties be worked out with states? Who would they be worked out with? So that's one of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And then I also said that there was no tax structure in the Articles of Confederation, no national treasury. And you might say, well, why do we need these things? I mean, a lot of people say that. But the reason you need them, and especially at the time of the American Revolution, is that the new America owed France a lot of money, for example, at that time. Well, who was going to pay them if there wasn't a central government? Was one state going to pay them? Were they going to try to get together and divvy it all up? What if one state couldn't pay? So there are all of these dilemmas, and those dilemmas in turn turn out to be weaknesses for the Articles of Confederation. And so, recognizing that, the First Continental Congress first meets in Annapolis and talks about, hey, maybe we should get together and, talk about strengthening or fixing the Articles of Confederation. And not every colony had a delegate there. And then they decide to meet again a second time in Philadelphia in the 1786, 1787, and that's where the Constitutional Convention begins, and it is delegates from most all the colonies who are getting together saying, okay, we're going to fix the Articles of Confederation or revise it, and in turn what they do is they write the Constitution. So that's where we're at, and the important thing to understand as far as the quiz goes, make sure you know that the Articles of Confederation come before the Constitution, and make sure you understand that the Articles of Confederation are insufficient to serve as the backbone or the structure or the constitution of a new government. So that's what you need to know there. There are people out there, there are historians out there who've said, you know what, the Articles of Confederation were good enough. What if we never had a constitution? And again, you can think through that as you learn more. But again, there's a bunch of people out there who want as little government as possible. So those folks would be, more for the Articles, and the rest of us, or if you want some government structure, or if you want federal highways, if you want federal defense, then you're pro-Constitution, and you understand you're going to have to pay some taxes, but you've accepted that because that's kind of the price of living, right? So there's a lot of stuff there. They write the Constitution in under a backdrop with a bunch of people who have just defeated the British. And the reason they went to war with the British in the first place was because they felt that Parliament and King George III were tyrants, that they were too demanding of the colonists as far as, if you remember the Stamp Act and the Stamp Tax and the Coercive Acts, and if you remember the Boston Tea Party and all of that stuff we read about in the last chapter, that represented the colonists and this tyrannical government that was far away in England, and it represented the colonists protesting against government overreach. So now, as the guys are in Philadelphia working out a constitution, they are still afraid of government overreach. So this idea of, hey, we're going to sit down and work out a constitution, and it's going to have some laws, and it's going to form a federal government. A lot of people are really afraid of that because they just fought hard to get away from a strong federal government. So that's sort of a dilemma that's going on at the time, not only with the delegates, but all through the countryside. And when I start to talk about Federalist and Anti-Federalist, which I guess is going to be right now, then the Anti-Federalists are the guys who really don't want a constitution. They feel like it's going to lead to a big government, a tyrannical government, and a government that's way into taxation, and they just fought to get away from that, so they don't want a constitution. Anti-Federalist. The Federalist, on the other hand, they do want a constitution, and they want it because they feel like in order to have a viable, strong country, a superpower of the day, I guess, that the country has to be unified when it comes to forming an army, forming a navy, coming up with some sort of tax structure or tariff structure so they can fund these national projects like an army and a navy. What about internal improvements? What about building the national road from Washington, west into Ohio? What about those things? How can a nation fund those things if the nation doesn't have any structure? So again, these are the dilemmas, and these are the things that the Federalists were thinking about. That we need these internal improvements. We need to build up industry. We need to put infrastructure in place. We need a federal bank. We need a federal currency. All of that stuff. That's what the Federalists wanted. So therein lies the dilemma. And I guess officially, as an American historian, I can't say that the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist were the first two political parties, because they really weren't. The Federalist and the Democratic Republicans were or the Republicans, the first two political parties, but they represented those factions. Okay, and so it's important to understand that. And I think, as you think about where we're at today and whether you follow politics or not, there's always arguing, and all of the arguing comes down to how much regulation or how much government overreach is government overreach. Should the central government be able to tell me that I can or can't have an abortion? So does the central government control my body? Does the central government dictate to me that I have to pay for health insurance? Does it dictate to me I have to pay income tax? What does it do? And so the dilemma is always too much government and not enough government. And those, I guess, opposing sides started in this period of time during the Constitutional Convention and afterwards, and they continue today. And that's why this history is kind of cool, because it's like, okay, this guy's a Federalist because, he's good with big government, and this guy's an Anti-Federalist because, he's a farmer and he wants no government regulation whatsoever. So I hope that kind of clarifies who the Federalists were, who the Anti-Federalists were, and let's get back into this Constitution thing. So they're writing the Constitution, they're in Philadelphia, and under this backdrop of fears of tyranny, and they decide, and there's a delegate there from every colony or two, and they decide that, okay, we have this Constitution, and if 9 of the colonies ratify it, vote for it, then it's going to be the U.S. It's going to be our Constitution. We're going to start the United States right then and now. So that's what happens. They write the Constitution. They do it in secrecy. They're locked in for several days, and no one can leave or take any notes out because it's very secret. And they get done with it, and they begin the process of ratification. Now, in the local newspapers of the day, there are these factions. There are papers that are pro-Federalist. There are papers that are anti-Federalist. If you've ever heard of something called the Federalist Papers, that's a number of papers that were written. They were opinions or viewpoints that were put forth in the newspaper, and the Federalist Papers were meant to convince people out in the countryside that they should be for the Constitution. The Federalist Papers were all the reasons why we need a Constitution. So they don't talk about the Federalist Papers in the book, or maybe they do, but you don't really need to know that part, but I just wanted to explain it to you. So in case you heard of Federalist Papers, it's like, what's that? Again, those were opinion pieces written by Hamilton and Madison, and they were in the local papers meant to sway public opinion. So that's what they were. And this was happening at a time where the states were going to put together constitutional conventions or ratification committees, and the states were going to decide, or the colonies were going to decide, do we want to ratify, do we want to vote for this Constitution, or do we not? So, long story short, a number of states say, okay, well, we're cool with this, we're fine. But a number of other states say, you know what, we're cool with this, but we are so worried about our natural rights as citizens, and there's really nothing in this Constitution as far as our rights are concerned. It's all about, we're going to have 3 branches, we're going to do these other things, but what about us, the people? And the states are concerned about it, and And they have good reason to be. Not only are they still afraid of tyrannical governments, but they're out in the frontier at that point, and they don't want anyone to screw with them. They don't want the government coming in and dictating to them how they farm, what they can say, what they can read, that sort of thing. They're really worried about it. So a number of states say, you know what, we are cool with the Constitution, but we're only cool with the Constitution if you guys add a Bill of Rights. And so the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and you should know those by now. So the First Amendment is the biggie, freedom of speech, right to assemble, freedom of religion. And then the Second Amendment you hear about all the time because that's the right to bear arms. And I could get off on a big tangent on that one, but I won't. But the first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights, and what happens is, once promises are made to the Anti-Federalist and to many of the states that, hey, we'll sit down, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to write a Bill of Rights. That promise is made. 9 states ratify the Constitution, and the Constitutional Convention, the framers, get back in there and work on this Bill of Rights. And the first 2 we talked about, and the other ones have to do with right to a jury trial, no cruel and unusual punishment, some of that stuff. So that's how this all comes together, and next thing you know, the Constitution is ratified by 9 states, and now the dilemma is, how do we build a workable government, and how are we all going to get along, especially considering the diversity and all of the widespread interest between these groups. So, if you look at Section 7.2 in the book, From Crisis to Constitution, that's basically what I just went through. Federalism, you should know what federalism is. It's really what this country is. It's anytime you have a country or a region where the political power is divided between states and a federal government. That's federalism, and that's what we live under. So you should know what that is, and you should know what the Bill of Rights is. It's the first 10 amendments, and it's incorporated into the Constitution. And Section 7.3 in the book talks about the founders and how they want to promote a virtuous society, that the principles of patriotism and virtue really lie on this idea of compromise and deference. In other words, you defer to whoever's in charge, and you trust them to make up laws and rules that are in your best interest. So there's deference and there's compromise, which is really the key to a good democracy. We don't really have that in this country. Every now and then we do. Every 20 years Congress comes together and they kind of get along, and then now they don't get along at all, and it ebbs and flows. But the founders are promoting this idea that we need to get along, we need to meet each other halfway. And how could they not? Because you have the southern part of the country who's depends on slavery, and you have the northern part of the country who really isn't into slavery at all. And so when they were writing the Constitution, they had to make compromises between these, widely separate interests. And so the fact that the Constitution came out like it did and it was ratified shows you that there was a willingness to compromise amongst people, and it's the only way they could have gotten it done. So there's that part, building a workable government. You're going to read about the Whiskey Rebellion in the chapter. And the Whiskey Rebellion, the book makes a big deal out of it. I think the thing to take away from it is, the people that produced whiskey, there was a new tax put on them by the Federalists, by Alexander Hamilton, and they didn't like it. Okay, and they're out in the frontier, and they start this rebellion. And this is really the first citizen-type uprising or rebellion that happens since the federal government is formed. And so the federal troops ride out into Pennsylvania, actually, into the Pittsburgh area, and they're ready to, quell or put down this rebellion from whiskey producers, and they do so with overwhelming force. And I think the reason the book likes the Whiskey Rebellion is because it's sort of a fun story, but at the same time, it illustrates the fact that this new federal government was not going to screw around with any citizen uprisings. Okay, so if the farmers get together and say, "Screw you, we're not shipping milk anymore," then the federal government's going to come in and take over. And I think the book likes the Whiskey Rebellion because it represents this overwhelming force that the federal government is willing to put to people that are protesting or people that are striking if it if it damages the national interest. So that's why the Whiskey Rebellion's in there. Section 7.5, building a nation among nations. You read about that. I mean, the biggie there, and I don't know how many of you know about the French Revolution, but the French Revolution really starts in the 1780s, and it's bloody and it's crazy, and it's all of these Parisian peasants and working class that are burning everything down, and there's all these different factions, and the French Revolution is, scaring the hell out of the founders because they just create this new country. They're trying to keep this diverse citizenry in check. And, the French Revolution comes along and they're freaking out saying, oh my God, what if that happens here? What if the citizens all come together here and kill all of us? Then what are we going to do? So that's what 7.5 is in the book. It's talking about partisan politics, but it's also talking about part of partisan politics was should we respect the French or should we hate the French because of the revolution? Now, of course, the anti-federalists totally were into the French Revolution. They dug all those revolutionaries because they were the independent guys that were, saying, hey, the people are in charge. But the Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, they wanted nothing to do with the French because they were like, hey, you know what? If you don't have a good central government, this is what happens. People get the guillotine. There's blood running in the streets, just like there was in Paris. So that's what 7.5 is about. And then the rest of the chapter talks about Anthony Wayne. So if you're in Northwest Ohio, I assume many of you are, some of you aren't, but Anthony Wayne, that name, the Anthony Wayne Trail, Fallen Timbers is out in Perrysburg. You might know about the Greenville Treaty if you are in the western border of Ohio and you go south to Greenville. These disputes all came about when the federal government took control of the Northwest Territory, which is comprised of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, approximately that big area, and so drove the Confederation of Iroquois off, drove the Indians off. That's what Anthony Wayne did. The Battle of Fallen Timbers, all of that stuff. If you're local to Toledo, you know about. But that stuff all happens during this period of time. And again, here's this dilemma. We have this brand new country. What are we going to do about the Native Americans? We really don't want them around. We really want their land. Our citizens want their land. So how are we going to deal with that? What about slaves? What about slave uprisings? What about slavery? What about runaway slaves? What are we going to do there with fugitive slaves? There are all of these dilemmas going on. So, when you read through the chapter, hopefully you can kind of get a feel for how difficult it was to work this stuff out, and we still haven't worked it out. I mean, we still haven't worked out the racial issues. We still haven't worked out, what kind of rights do you have? What kind of rights do you have as a woman? We haven't worked out. Native American stuff yet. So, this is all still going on, but it's cool to think about because it all starts back then and you can trace it to today. And I think it sort of makes the Constitution a little more approachable. Lastly, in the chapter, section 7.7, there's something called created equal. And, the dilemma here is that, how can these founders say all men are created equal? And then, crush the rights of anyone who isn't a white guy. I mean, this was a total white guy deal. All of these guys in Philly, they were rich white guys that owned land. How can they look after the interest of the rest of us, the poor or the people of color or women? How can you set up a country on these values of equality but not practice what you preach? And so this is a real dilemma. So when you read through Created Equal, think about that. Think about how could these guys do this? How can Thomas Jefferson say, you know what, I think that slaves and people of color aren't as smart as white people, but then at the same time he's sleeping with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. Is this guy a hypocrite? How could these guys allow slavery? And so when we study history, we tend to judge, but what we really need to do is sort of meet these guys where they're at. And what I mean by that is you kind of need to meet them in the time frame where they lived, where obviously they all had moral and ethical dilemmas, but because it was the way things were at that time, it was slightly more acceptable to them. And I know that doesn't make sense to a lot of us. It's like, hey, how could you enslave somebody? But that's what they did. That's what they were used to. That was their, I always say that was their bird cage, if you will, because I always talk about, you know, people say, oh, the poor bird is in a cage. Well, if the bird was born in a cage, you know, that's their world. That's what they know. And that's a useful, I think, metaphor to look at these guys and say, man, were they really creeps? Were they hypocrites? Well, yeah, they were by our standards, but by their standards, during that period of time, they really weren't so much. So that's just the way it is. So this is, I'm sorry I've gone about 25 minutes, but there's a lot to unpack here, and I'd love to go on with more examples of Federalist, but Anti-Federalist, and rights and impositions and compromises, but we'll pick that up on the next chapter. So we have a quiz this week. Let me go through it real quick. Really easy, 5 questions. So one of them, you got to know the Articles of Confederation. All you need to know is, did it come before the Constitution and what was wrong with it? Where is the First Amendment found? So there's a question there. I'm not even going to tell you that one because you should know. And there's a couple of other ones I threw in. So here's one. A Muslim ban or restrictions against any religion is unconstitutional, true or false? False. So I frame that question to you because you'll hear in politics that, you know, the president wants to ban Muslims, or this senator wants to, you know, ban these people. And again, that's all unconstitutional stuff. No one said this was a Christian nation, but the First Amendment said, hey, freedom of religion. So whether you're a Muslim American or a Christian American, you're the same, you're fine. And that's absolutely the way it should be. Know who Abigail Adams was. All right. So, you know, John Adams, you know, wife. And she writes to her husband after the Revolution, and she's talking about government, and she says, remember the ladies. And you'll read about that in the text, and basically what she's asking is, hey, think about us and think about our rights. Again, women wouldn't get the right to vote for another 100 and some years, but Abigail Adams and other women you'll read about sort of get the ball rolling, and that's a nice takeaway in this chapter. They do a good job with it. And then question 5 is about the Alien and Sedition Acts, and you'll read about them in the text. And basically, the Alien and Sedition Acts violated the right to, and then there are a couple of choices, and you can pick the correct answers, but the correct answer is free speech. So there's that for the quiz. I hope you guys are having a good week. I'm relatively caught up on my grading, and I appreciate your patience with all of that. Be safe. I'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.